Ileana. The ice-cold fluid splurged across my belly, numbing around the areas that the ultrasound touched. I could hear the whooshing noise echo in the quiet room. I knew I'd be able to tell, even before she parted her lips, whether or not I was pregnant. No amount of words could describe how tense the atmosphere was. I clenched my heart with my teeth. It was as though my whole existence led up to this moment. The final truth was whether or not I was pregnant for Denver. I guess this is what happens when you unfortunately fall for someone you know you should never have. Denver couldn't have been any more different from me. I was an Omega slave, and he was an Alpha King. I was also a bloodhound, while he belonged to the Black Moon Pack. Arch-rivals since the beginning of time, we were doomed from the start. It never seemed to be a thought for him that we could ever be anything more. Whenever I looked into his eyes, it was quite clear that he'd only ever see me as his contract wife, not capable of love. But I had a feeling everything was going to change when he found out that I was pregnant. Immediately, I saw it in the doctor's eyes, and a heavy exhale left my lips. I turned to face the machine, but even though I was unable to make out a single part of the foetus, I could very much hear its heartbeat. "Congratulations!" Dr. Giselle exclaimed, and my hands clutched my lips. Oh, it was a surreal moment, one that the last 2 years had led up to. "I am pregnant." There was a crack in my voice as I whispered, "Yes, you are." She ran her hands through my hair, roping me in for a hug, and on her shoulders I cried. I didn't know how much I wanted this, until it happened. I can't wait to tell Denver. He'd lose his mind. I sharply withdrew, eyes bright with an idea. I knew how much he wanted this child, and was I delusional to think that it could finally change everything? That I could capture the cold and ruthless Alpha's heart, my husband. I have to go. I climbed down the bed, immediately scrapping for my bags. I couldn't wait another second to see him. "I need to talk to you." I sent a text, grinning like an idiot. I felt a million things all at the same time, but most of all, I was truly happy. Little did I know that was the last time in a really long time that I'd feel such way. I arrived at the Pack Villa and sighting Denver's car parked in the driveway. I sucked in a deep breath before mounting the front porch. The air was warm and that smile didn't leave my lips until I was faced with him. Denver was seated in the dark, like he had already been waiting for me. "Oh," I exclaimed, "I didn't know you'd be here so fast." "Well, I have something to tell you, but only after I make you your favorite meal." I was on the cusp of hanging my coat when Denver arose. "Ileana," there was something quite harrowing about the way he called my name that caused my heart to drop into my stomach. I turned back to him, and there was barely any emotion in his eyes. "Have you already had something to eat?" I asked softly. "No, a yes." He pushed a hard lump down his throat. "I got your text, and I have something to tell you too," Denver added. My brows immediately arched. Did he already know, before I was able to tell him? No, it couldn't be that. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite decipher. Damned be the one that ever assumed to know who the Alpha truly was. But at least for the past 2 years, I'd been married to him. I'd unconsciously picked up each of his mood changes and what they meant, and I knew well enough that this wasn't about something good. Oh, this time. My voice was low and almost inaudible. "What is that?" "It is about us." Denver broke the news. "I am afraid I can't keep this up for much longer. This isn't working, Ileana." He croaked, and it felt like a knife had stabbed into my chest. I almost fell backward, but I had to hold myself still. Time and everything else was frozen. But there was a loud noise that rang through my ears so much that I could barely hear myself. "It has been 2 years and the contract is nearly over. Still, you've been unable to provide with a child." "But," I echoed. No words came out. Just the endless tears from my eyes as I watched him dump a stack of papers to the table. I inched closer to make sure that this was real. that it was truly happening. Just when I was about to tell him the good news, Denver had already penned down his signature to end this marriage. I looked up at him in disbelief, but his eyes were empty and void. I couldn't believe I fell victim to Malik Denver. How foolish of me to think that I could actually change him. How foolish of me to fall for him at all. It is over. He pressed his lips into each other. There was a stabbing pain in my chest and a crack in my voice. I don't understand, I stuttered. What is there not to understand? I want a fucking divorce. 2 years, that was it. That was the entire plan. I gave 2 years of my life to you, and you have given me nothing, Ileana. You know this isn't working. The truth is, you've known for a long time now. There is no point in waiting anymore. This has to end now. But I love you. It escaped my lips. I didn't know how, neither did I know why, but I blurted it out. And I guess some part of me was expecting some grand confession next. Rather, all that slapped me in the face was a hoarse scoff. You can't love me. This was merely an arrangement. I've made that pretty clear from the start. But I do. I interrupted him, and sharply, he drew back with his knuckles against his teeth. Well, I don't love you, Denver yelled. I don't love you, Ileana. I never have. This was never what I wanted. He said, and his words kept ringing in my head. I don't love you. I never have, but you are my mate. I whimpered, desperately wanting to hold on to him as I cried. Then I reject you, he coldly refuted. I, Alpha Malik Denver, hereby reject you, Ileana Jacobs, as my mate, bringing an end to this union. His voice felt like a sword that went through my chest, slicing my heart into a million tiny pieces. He looked at me with a commanding glare, and I knew I didn't have much of an option. I, Ileana Jacobs, accept your rejection, I whispered. There was no mending of a heart that had been broken so much like mine. There was the man who saved me 2 years ago, but the Denver standing in front of me was different, or perhaps these were his truest colors. And for the first time, my eyes weren't clouded by delusions. I broke down into tears, but all he cared about was signing the papers. He tapped against the sheet, and a tear of mine soaked through it. You have until tomorrow to sign it, and come up with the next plan as to where you would stay from now. I'd grant you a leave if that is what you want, but besides that, I have nothing else to give you. Ileana Denver brushed into his shoulders as he walked out of the door. It closed behind him, but for the most of it, his words were still in the air. So was his cologne and his presence. I heard his voice echo through the door, and almost suddenly another. It was an effeminate voice chuckling alongside his. My curiosity was what shattered me as I leaped closer to the door. I opened it slightly to peek, and Denver was in the arms of another woman so quickly. She had long blonde hair and skin blemishlessly white as milk. Her clothes barely covered the right parts of her body, but his hands did. She was really beautiful. And had everything I didn't. Come on. Let's go upstairs. Her voice was all giggly as she wrapped her arms around him. Denver crashed his lips into hers, leading her to the stairs, but before he left, he darted one last glare back to me. Like he knew I was watching, he knew I was shattered, but he just didn't care. This was the moment that sparked for me. And to think I was already envisioning a future where we could be a happy family. Him and I, and the child in my womb who he didn't still know about. Whom he never would. Denver was a horrible person, and I'd only just realized that today. I didn't want that sort of a father for my kid. And neither did I want him to stay with me only because I was pregnant. It was clear he never felt anything for me over the past 2 years, so it was almost a genuine fear that he might try to take the baby away from me. He didn't deserve the child. He didn't deserve me. I lunged myself to the table across which were the divorce papers, and with quivering hands, I took up the pen, signing alongside his. I fought to hold back the tears in my eyes, but I failed miserably. I couldn't believe this was the end. I wanted nothing more than to leave. There was no place for me here. There hadn't been over the past 2 years. Even as I scavenged through my wardrobe, I realized none of the things actually belonged to me. I could set this whole place ablaze in anger, but rather, I chose to walk away, leaving him his ring on the table. I was utterly defeated and dispirited as I walked out those doors. All I knew was I never wanted to see Denver again. I wanted a fresh start in a place outside of Oakland or Tombsdale. A place very far away from here. I'd walked in with the brightest of smiles, but here I was, leaving with a river of tears. The winds blew through my hair as I took a brave step forward. The intention was to leave everything behind. A fresh start. A new life. Just me. My hands fell to clasp my barely showing stomach and my child. That was the day I truly left my terrible past behind, heading towards an even more uncertain future. But if there was one thing that I knew, it was that no one could ever find out about the Alpha's secret baby. No one. Years later, my eyes settled on the untamed flames of the bonfire, and even with the warmth that emitted from it. It was still a cold night in the mountains of Tuscany, where I'd stayed for the last 6 years. There was a rumble in the skies above me, preceded by a bolt of lightning that struck the earth. The breeze was cold against my skin, grazing through my hair which swayed left and right. I folded my arms with a jacket over my shoulders. Until the rain started to pour, I wouldn't go back into my tent. I resolved in my head. It had rained heavily here each night for the past week. And although it was hard to believe the Tuscany mountains were a real place, they really were. I had to see for myself when I stumbled here, one random day 6 years ago, after journeying halfway across the earth in search of a home. There wasn't one quite as welcoming as here, but the weather said otherwise. Of course, I had found ways to cope, but still, on some days when the harsh winds would blow, I was reminded that this place wasn't my home, not that it wasn't Bloodhound or Black Moon. As you have seen, all my life I've always struggled to fit in. It wasn't any different now with the humans. Tuscany was filled with them. It was about 95% mountains and forest, but the remaining 5% were humans. Not a single shifter was here. It was nothing like Oakland, which was a good thing because when I arrived here, that was exactly what I was looking for. A fresh start. A new beginning. For both myself and my help. Mum. Immediately drawing me out of my thoughts were the screams that echoed from inside the tent. I arose and burst through the zipper, grasping his little hands as he shivered. Elijah was panting with beads of sweat forming along the lines of his forehead. He was drenched, and he was quivering like he'd just seen a ghost. "Are you okay?" I held him close to my chest, placing a soft kiss against his forehead, and his breathing slowed down after some time. Then he could speak. The first thing he did was lift his gaze into my eyes. "I had a nightmare." There was a crack in his voice and I could see in his eyes that he was so afraid. "It is okay," I held him tighter. "It is not real. You are here with me now. Mommy's here." I heaved. And as the winds started to howl outside the tent, I finally closed it up. I could still see the reflection of the fire as it started to die down because of the rain, but soon after, it had completely disappeared. Elijah had fallen asleep again in my hands, and I heaved a deep breath as I looked down at him. As I said, this was supposed to be a fresh start, a new beginning for myself and my son, Elijah. But these days, it started to feel like the exact opposite. 24, 25, 20 sigh, fuck. I cussed as I fell on my bed, heavy breaths escaping from my lips. I turned to face Alicia, who was counting my push-ups, and as she handed me the bottle of water, she had disappointment in her eyes. "That is far less than the last time," she muttered, reaching for my hands to help me up. I leaped to my feet, gushing down the water and then wiping the sweat across my face. It was the next morning after a heavy downpour, and it looked nothing like it had rained last night. The sun was shining intensely in the skies, and everyone had come out of their tents for their exercise. Life in Tuscany was a routine. You get up as early as 6 a.m., and training starts. Breakfast is strictly by 10 a.m. Not a second less or a second more, and it was only for about an hour. Training continues until noon, and then we're allowed into the woods to hunt down dinner. That could last for hours, and alas, by 6 p.m., we return back to the tent with our pairs and our game. Sometimes it felt like nothing had changed. The trees surrounding us were just like Oakland. Well, the part of it that wasn't the city. And the commune I was in was very similar to how packs operate. The routine. Dining together. Training, but at least I wasn't a slave to these people, like I was to my own pack. They were strangers and humans, but they also opened their arms to me and my child when I wandered here 5 years ago. They knew very little of where I came from, nor did they know anything about my past. I acted lost and naive, which wasn't really a facade because I was lost. I'd left Denver without thinking about where I was even going. And to top it all off, I wasn't just responsible for myself but for the child I was carrying. Those weeks on the roads were the toughest, and I didn't even think I would make it alive as a rogue. I just kept walking and running and walking for weeks on end. Months. Until I ended up here, and it is where I've been with Elijah ever since. I didn't think I ever wanted to leave again. Here, they knew me as a human, and Elijah too. It was like I could be someone different, away from my past and all the trauma I'd endured. I was no longer Ileana. I went by Anna here. It was what everyone, including Alicia, knew me as. It was tough keeping my secret sometimes, and although it helped that I still hadn't come fully into my wolf form, at this I had given up. But it was especially harder when you have a growing son whose wolf aspects wasted no time in kicking in. Elijah was 6 years old now. His violent nightmares started when he was 5. It was accustomed to the male shifters at the infancy stage, and so was the increased awareness and heightened senses. I had to hide that from everyone else in the commune because we were humans here. I thought we could be, but with each day that passed, I realized it was impossible. But I didn't want to leave, I told myself. If I did, there was nowhere else to go. I'll do better tomorrow. I nodded at Alicia, who scoffed lightly from her lips. At that moment, there was a bell that rang from a distance, and I pulled out my phone to check the time. It is 10. I reflexively announced, kicking my feet forward. Time for breakfast. My eyes searched through the dispersing crowds for Elijah. Where is my son? I asked, and Alicia shrugged her shoulders. I faced the children's section where I had just seen him some seconds ago, but he had disappeared now. My heart stomped in my chest as I walked back, in the opposite direction from where everyone else was facing. Have you seen Elijah? I started to ask, gliding through shoulders and bodies. Freya. I grasped his nature teacher, and she was startled at first. The rest of the kids were packing up, but Elijah was still missing. Where is he? I panted heavily. I was just looking for you. She gritted through her teeth, and it was a tone that showed something was clearly wrong. She roped my hands into a tent, and I expected to see Elijah. But instead, it was another kid who was bleeding from his mouth. That isn't Elijah, I stuttered, and Freya looked me dead in the eyes. You don't say, she remarked. This is Chester, one of the kids in Elijah's grade and a very close friend of his. Today, Elijah attacked Chester, and he is the reason for the bleeding, as you can see, Freya said, and I clutched my lips immediately. Where is he? This is the 3rd fight he has been involved in, and it has only just been a week. The rest of his mates are scared of him. He is a monster, Chester interrupted, and his eyes were filled with tears. Soon, mine began to water too. Anna, Freya called, and I looked back at her. I am afraid if this happens again, you and Elijah might have to leave the commune. The safety and wellness of everyone is our utmost priority, and her voice started to fade into my ears, and it was barely audible at this point. I plunged myself outside the tent, and my vision dazed as I stared ahead at the woods. I closed my ears with my hands and shut my eyes until I was relieved again. And by this time, Freya was right next to me. "Where is he?" I asked her for the last time, and she threw a look into the woods. He ran away. Without waiting to hear another word, I sprinted down the hill and ran through the forest. "Elijah!" I yelled his name. This had only happened once in the past, and the fear was just as crippling. "Elijah!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, shaking my head off every negative thought that was telling me something bad had already happened to him. My feet splattered through the muddy earth as I went deeper into the thick forest, and it was darker with each step I took. But alas, I found him, beneath an enclosed shed with his back against a tree and his arms around his knees. "Elijah!" I gasped in relief, throwing myself forward to where he was. He turned to me and I immediately grasped him in for a hug. The tears in my eyes streamed down my flustered face. I was so worried. I wept and there was a crack in my voice. "You can't leave me like that, Elijah. I told you, and you promised the last time." I looked into his eyes and they were so afraid. I couldn't even yell at him. "I am sorry, Mommy," he apologized. "I didn't want you to be worried. It is okay." I held his hands. They were just saying so many mean things about me in class today. Chester too, and I thought he was my friend. I just got so angry, and I don't know what came over me, he explained, and I pushed a hard lump down my throat. Of course, I knew what came over him. It was his wolf. That is the thing. He wasn't a human. He didn't even know that himself. None of them knew. Maybe this was a bad idea, and as much as I wanted it to be, Tuscany wasn't my home. It wasn't Elijah's home. He ought to be around a pack of wolves who could train him to control his anger and be noble. They couldn't do that here, but then again his pack was, I am pretty sure, non-existent at this point. It had been 6 years since I last heard from anyone in Oakland. I don't really belong here, Mommy. No matter how hard I try, they still make fun of me. I can't ever fit in, and Elijah broke down into tears on my shoulders, and as a mother, hearing my child cry the way he did at that moment, it shattered my heart. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I know," I replied softly with a hand smothering down his back. "This isn't your fault, Eli," I said before, pulling away from him. "Well, punching Chester was," I scoffed, and he chuckled softly for a moment. "I told you before. Use your words. Even when you are angry, use your words over your fist." I ran my hands through his hair and he pouted. "It won't happen again, Mommy." He promised, even going as far as joining his pinky finger to mine, and I broke it off with a kiss. Pulling him up, we were set back down the hill when my phone suddenly rang, and I stopped in my tracks immediately. Nobody ever called. Pulling it out of my pocket, there was a furrow between my brows, and the voice that I heard next caused my heart to sink into my chest. My hand was shaking as I placed the phone to my ears. "Eliana." Her voice was tender and shaky. No one had called me that in years. "Grandma." I recognized her voice almost immediately, and hearing it again left a sting in my chest. "Eliana," this time, bearing as much familiarity. "It is your father." She wasted no time in breaking the news, and my heart leaped in the back of my throat. "He is deathly ill, Eliana. Please come back home." And those words kept ringing in my ear as I stood there. Come home. Home. Not Tuscany. Not Tombsdale, but Oakland, my home. "Eliana, are you there?" My grandmother asked, and a loud sob rang through my ears from over the phone. Heartbroken, terrified, and soul-shattering, I could hear the pain in her fragile, cracking voice, and soon, tears started to form in my eyes. I stopped in my tracks on my way down the hill, and Elijah was right beside me. It took a moment for me to fully grapple with what she was saying, and even longer for me to say anything back. I was just so confused. I don't understand. I softly whispered, "Your father is sick, Eliana." I'd heard her the first time, but that was only one of the many things that raced through my mind at that moment. "No, how are you even? How are you talking to me right now?" I asked. "I thought you were dead, Grandma. All those years they told me." "Eliana," she interrupted. Her voice was just as I remembered. "I wasn't dead. Your father only kept me away. It was what Sienna wanted. She'd brainwashed him for all those years." She added, and I pushed a hard lump down my throat. "Now that he is sick, where is she? Where is Jackson?" I asked. And that name left a sour taste in the back of my mouth, and all my grandmother did was let out a heavy exhale. Thick with all her unmentioned worries, and I could tell whatever was going on in Oakland was pretty serious. "Oh, Eliana," she gasped, "nothing is as it was anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your father fell ill not so long ago, terribly stricken by a disease no one has a cure to. He first started to lose his memories and then all his strength. His health has deteriorated ever since, and these days, we're just counting down the days until—" She could barely continue, and I felt the tears stream down my cheeks. "Until he dies now, Eliana." And even with my rough relationship with my father, hearing those words still broke my heart into pieces. Those were words a daughter should never hear about her dad nonetheless. But that wasn't even all. And Sienna and Jackson, they're just waiting patiently for him to die and for his alpha title to be stripped off him. Jackson's looked forward to the day that he is finally crowned alpha for so long now, and the people have dreaded that day. He has started to rule since your father got sick and incapable, and he has done so with an iron fist. He has been merciless to everyone under him. We're all treated like slaves, like it is a dictatorship. No one dares say too much or disobey him. And even now, I am hearing of a war that he has declared. It is unsafe here in Bloodhound, Eliana. We're all just scared, and Jackson, he can't take over. If there was anyone familiar with Jackson's wrath, it was me. And suddenly, the memories of those nights that he would sneak into my dungeon came into my mind as hot, tumultuous flashes. I shut my eyes with my heart between my teeth. Of course, no one else knew but myself till now. He was only my stepbrother then, and he was so cruel, I couldn't imagine how ruthless he could become with so much power as an alpha of the pack. Bloodhound, for that matter. A pack usually known for its peace and collectiveness, but also the same one that turned their backs on me when I needed them. The ones that blamed me unrighteously for my mother's death. What do you want me to do now, Grandma?" I stuttered, and there came another sigh from her lips. "There is only one person that can stop your brother from taking over. And, Grandma," I interrupted because I knew exactly where this was going. As I stood still, the winds went through my hair and dried the tears on my cheeks. My throat was sore and so were my eyes. "That person is you, Eliana," she continued nonetheless. "You are as much of an heir as he is, and if you come back and challenge for the role of an alpha, then it could block Jackson. Everyone knows that you would be a much better ruler than he could ever be," she whispered, and I shook my head. "The same people that treated me like slaves." There was a crack in my voice. "That made me go through all of that when I was just a little girl. Now you want me to abandon everything, including the life that I have made here, and you want me to come back and help them?" I asked her. "Eliana, because it is not fair, you know. It is not fair that you ask this of me, Grandma." I broke down into tears, and by the sound of her voice, I could tell she did too. "We have nowhere to turn, Eliana. You are my last hope. You are the last hope of the entire pack. If Jackson rules, he would run the whole pack into the ground in no time, and Bloodhound would be no more. It would be worse than it already is, she said softly. I can't be Alpha, I muttered, and I can't be Luna, I can't be anything at all. I blurted out, this wasn't what I wasn't meant for. I can't take it, Grandma. Please don't make me take it, I whispered, and she hummed. Of course you can't, she replied. You are meant for so much more even. Have you forgotten all those years that I told you day after day that you were special? I had to remind you so you would never forget. My grandma said, but I shook my head. You have no idea what you are talking about because you left, I exclaimed, and my life was so unbearable for so many years. I never felt special, not for one day of my life. But I felt broken and shattered into pieces. I felt mistreated and worthless. I felt abandoned and devastated, hurt and dispirited, so you can't stand there and tell me that I am special. I cried. I never left, Ileana, she answered. I never wanted to, but it was Sienna. She convinced them to take me into exile, and I too have spent so long in the darkness of the forest. I'd felt broken and devastated and dispirited, and all those things when I thought I would never see you again, Ileana. But thankfully, your father has come to his senses, and so have the rest of the pack. The real villains are Sienna and Jackson, and they want to take everything from us. I pushed a hard lump down my throat before I echoed. Dad knows? Yes, she replied. Does he know that? Does he know that you called me? I whispered, and Grandma Abby heaved. Of course he does. It was his idea to come to me. It was also his idea to call you, she continued. He has realized his mistakes, and how he'd treated and unfairly blamed you all those years for your mother's death. And I could sit on this end and tell you how sorry he was, but he wants a chance to tell you to your face. He wants you to come back home, Ileana. We all do. And there was such a time that those words would have meant the whole world to me, and I would have come running. But that was 6 years ago. So much had changed now. I was different. I had Elijah, a secret no one knew about, and it was going to stay that way. Alpha Denver could never know of his son, but the chances of him finding out were more if I moved back to Oakland. Besides, it wasn't even safe for me with Jackson, and how we last left off. So many odds were stacked against me, and my mind was filled with uncertainty and confusion. On one hand was Elijah, who was finding it so hard to fit in with the humans. I didn't blame him because sometimes I don't think I fully have myself. But it could be so much better back in Oakland. He wouldn't have to feel so different. I would just have to keep him away from Tombsdale. There was a brief pause over the phone, and my stomach had tied into a knot. Mommy, are you okay? Elijah asked softly, and I sniffled through my nose, wiping the tears from my eyes. I am, I replied, holding him close, and the next thing I heard was my grandma's voice. Who was that? She asked, hearing him from over the phone, and a hard lump slipped down my throat. There was no use hiding him from her. She was the one person I could actually trust. And an idea struck me. It wouldn't be so bad if I kept Elijah with her amidst everything. It would be so helpful to know that he was with someone safe, someone who could take care of him and train him just like she trained me. It is my son, I whispered. There was a crack in her voice bridled with disbelief, and I nodded. It is your grandson. A light-hearted sob echoed from her lips at my words, and as his fingers intertwined with mine, I drew him closer to me. Don't worry, you'll meet him when I come back, I muttered before pressing my lips together, and my grandma gasped. Ileana, she called softly. You are coming back. Did I have a choice? Of course I did. But I would be just as much of a monster as they were to me if I turned my back on them when they needed me. I could escape, hide and run from Bloodhound, But the truth remains that it was still my pack. It was my home, not anywhere else. And most importantly, it was my mother's home. She loved the pack so dearly, and they meant so much to her. Even as she passed, they always said her last wish was that the pack never crumble, that we take care of each other, that they take care of me. I would do the same when I grow older. They failed on their end. But it didn't mean I had to on mine. After all, this was all for her. Everything I did was for my mother. Even this decision I'd taken. I am coming back. My voice was low, and my eyes set on the Tuscany hills in the distance. I had to leave this place. You don't know how much this means to me, Ileana, to all of us, my grandma said. It won't be an easy war standing up to Jackson, but I am sure it would be one that we would win in the end because it is a war we're fighting together. She continued, and I heaved in a deep breath. Like I said, things were different now. I wasn't who I was 6 years ago. Here in the commune, we trained every day to be warriors, to face the obstacles and grab them by their horns. We were trained to stand up to our greatest fears and the trauma of our past. We were trained to overcome, and so I had faith too, and Jackson didn't scare me so much anymore. I could finally, after so long, face him and charge him for all the terrible things he'd done to me. And in the end, I could rescue my pack with Elijah by my side. It wouldn't be so hard now, would it? Eliana, my grandma called after a while, and I held the phone against my ears. Her words slipped easily from her lips, falling to cradle around my heart, and a smile crept to my lips. Your mother would be so proud, she'd said softly before hanging up the call. As the winds flushed into my face, I sucked in a deep breath and Elijah squeezed my hand. Who was that? He asked, and I looked at him. Was that Daddy? Those words escaped his lips, and it stung my heart so suddenly. I looked into Elijah's eyes. This was the first time he called that name and he meant it. Caught off guard, I fluttered my eyelashes. No? I paused, and Elijah shrugged before making his way down the hills. No, it was not. And as soon as I reached the bottom of the hill, I was met with Alicia. There you are, she exclaimed. You missed breakfast. Yeah, I shrugged my shoulders. I wasn't hungry. Are you okay? Your face seems a little flustered, she noted, and I just scoffed lightly. You know what? I am okay, Alicia. I reached out to her shoulders before flashing a smile at her. And thank you, I continued. Over the last 6 years, Alicia has been my closest friend here. But as I looked at her and around the mountains, I knew it was time to go. Thank you for everything. I left her with a furrow between her brows as I drew Elijah's hands. Hey, I want to tell you something. I held him close, because where do I even begin? I threw one last look back at Alicia and it was the last time I ever saw her. Because immediately the clock struck midnight and the beginning of a new day. I woke Elijah up in the tent. I'd already packed my things in his and he knew what was going on. Well, enough. He knew enough. It is time, I whispered, beneath the sound of the cricket noises, and he yawned with his arms above his head. I carried him on my back, climbing out of the tent and down the hill. On one side were the forests, and the other one took you outside Tuscany hills. However, it wasn't until I reached beside the giant billboard that said, "Goodbye to the mountains," that I realized this was truly happening. The night was mercilessly cold, and I gazed into the star-filled skies for a moment. I was really leaving. And most of all, I was really going back. Come on. After so long, I was going back home. Grandma. I immediately threw myself into her arms as soon as I walked into the cabin doors. She was strapped to her wheelchair, but her arms were still strong enough to wrap around me. Tears welled up in my eyes before they came running down my cheeks. I never thought I'd see her again. And even after hearing her on the phone, it was nothing compared to actually seeing her, holding her. And I sobbed onto her shoulders. "Eliana," she sang softly from her lips. "Oh, Grandma." I heaved, and there was no emotion quite like this. As Adam stood at the door with Elijah, it took me more than a moment to fully gather myself together. And when after I stood, my eyes were still, wet with tears. They fell to her, and so were her own. I stuttered. "I can't believe this." "Me neither," she echoed, intertwining her fingers with mine. I darted my eyes around the wooden cabin. It was warm and cozy in here, although it was a structure at the furthermost outskirts of Oakland. This was a place I never thought existed, and even for so long, I thought my grandma was dead. I was about 6 years old when they took her from me, and everyone called her crazy ever since the death of my mother, her daughter. But I knew she wasn't crazy, she was just hurt. But she looked different now. Better, maybe with a few more lines across her face, the wheelchair and her eyes not being as sharp. She was nearly 75 years old, and faring even better than some her age. I think it is a werewolf gene. We generally age better than humans. It was something I noticed back in Tuscany, but that wasn't what crossed my mind at that moment. Our eyes interlocked, and suddenly, I was 5 years old again in my grandma's arms. And she was watching over me as I fell asleep, whispering beneath her voice how special I was. And she may have looked different now, but she was still the same. "Welcome, Eliana," she paused. "Welcome home." I sat on the couch and it gave a little squeak. My eyes still roamed around the room. I assumed this was where she was for the past 6 years. It was then Adams wheeled her out. She had said he was her caretaker, ordered by my father to watch over her. She held in her arms 2 cups of coffee, and I instantly rushed to relieve them from her hands. She insisted on making them. Adams muttered when my eyes met his, and I chuckled softly. She could be rather stubborn sometimes, but like I said, nothing had changed. "I am so happy you are back," she whispered as I took a sip of my warm coffee. I swallowed it down my throat, even closing my eyes to savor the taste. Ugh, I've missed this. The smell of freshly brewed coffee swept through my nose. Tuscany had nothing like this. "I am happy too, Ma," I heaved. Just then, an emotion flashed across her face for barely a second, and the smile faded slowly from her lips. "I remember it like it was yesterday," she started, placing the cup on the table. An arch appeared between my brows. "I never wanted to leave you, Eliana, but Sienna, she captured me when your father wasn't there. She'd been trying to get rid of me ever since their marriage because I never gave my blessings." Nana paused before lifting her face to me. "How could I?" There was a crack in her voice. "She stole everything that belonged to your mother, and everyone was just trying to forget her. Your father included, and I didn't want to. Susanna's not just something that could be replaced, and deep down, I was scared that even when you grew up, you wouldn't know who your mother was. So I fought. They called me crazy, but I still fought. And at the end of the day, the devil won in the end." Her voice broke. "Not only did she silence me, but she managed to get me exiled out here, and I don't know what she told your father, but he agreed to it. And this," she looked around the room, her eyes brimming with tears. "This is where I've been for the past few years, and I can't ever go back." My heart shattered hearing her speak of this, finally knowing that all of this was because of my mother. Because she didn't want her to be forgotten. Sienna was evil, but I never knew she was to this extent. It was one of the reasons I was back here. They weren't even full bloodhounds. But because of my mother, she and Jackson had gained so much power that they seemed unstoppable. They thought they could make our lives a living hell and get away with it. My grandmother built this pack from after the Cold War when it was nothing, shredded and withered into pieces. She should never have been unjustly exiled. And since it was nothing we took pretty seriously, I understood now why she wasn't able to come back for me, why she never stepped foot back into the pack. To go against an exile rule was an unforgivable taboo, punishable by the death penalty. It was one of the many harsh traditions and laws that governed the entire pack. Grandma always said how Mum was against them, and how she was fighting to get these laws reversed for our freedom. But it was a fight she never saw to the end because of what happened. I saw what had become of Oakland today. And the first thing I could think of was how much it would break her heart to see the same thing. The land was dry and infertile. The trees were gone. Roads were broken down, and even the sign that was our pride in Oakland no longer flickered. The town was dying, they said, but the truth was it was already dead. I am so sorry. Nana reached for my hands again, after wheeling a lot closer to where I was. As tears formed in my eyes, I looked around until they fell to the table right beside me. Across it was a framed photo, and I recognized the two people in it almost immediately. Was this her? I pointed to my grandmother and her lips broke into a smile. Yes, she said softly. That is Susanna. That is your mother. The tears rolled down my cheeks and plastered against the frame. I stared into her forever youthful eyes, and that smile everyone always said looked like mine. And by everyone, I meant my grandma. She wasn't lying. Even my eyes were the same color and the way we stood. Seeing this photo filled me with so much purpose and an indescribable emotion. She was beautiful, I whispered. Nana nodded. I gave you a photo of her, she added. And I reached into my pocket, pulling out from a section of my wallet a tiny picture which I handed over to her. I still have it, I whispered. And it was a picture she gave me when I was 6 and started to ask questions about my mother. And that was the day I truly understood what had happened. I held that photo, promising to keep it forever, the last thing of hers that I had. And through everything, from Denver to Tuscany, over the last 6 years, I took it everywhere with me. And my grandmother had a proud smile across her face as she gave it back to me. And you? She heaved, as my eyes fell to my hands. Where have you been? Alas, the question I dreaded, but one I could never escape. Where should I even begin? I thought to myself. Is it from when Alpha Denver rescued me while I was fleeing from my rapist stepbrother? Or when I fell in love with the Alpha, even going as far as a marriage of convenience, a marriage that he ended after 2 years, and even after finding out that I was his mate, he still rejected me but unknown to him. I was finally pregnant with his child. A child who I ran away with halfway across the world until I ended up in a cult-like commune. And that is where I've been for the last 6 years. I could tell her that at once and watch my Nana succumb to a heart attack. I mean, it was the story of my life that even I couldn't believe sometimes. But it was what happened. I've just been. I pressed my lips together. I've just been. I later settled on an answer, and I am glad she took it as I didn't want to talk about it. Not yet at least, so she just left it at that. Her fingers crawled to my face as she caressed my cheeks softly. I let out a light scoff. The necklace too. I suddenly remembered, and even she arched her brows. It wasn't until I called Elijah to stand in front of her and showed her the pendant he was wearing around his neck that she smiled. I held onto it after all these years, I added proudly. I figured it was something he should have, something of hers, since he didn't really know anyone you know. I whispered, and Elijah slouched into my arms. I get that he was shy. He wasn't this naturally quiet, but then again, this was someplace he'd never been. Nana slowly reached for his arms, and I turned him to face her. Elijah, I want you to meet someone, I whispered into his ears. He lifted his gaze and her eyes watered yet again. I didn't even know you had a son, she muttered, and a hard lump slipped down my throat. Well, no one does, I whispered. And I'd like to keep it that way, for now, I continued. I was thinking he could stay with you in the meantime. Mommy, Elijah called and I held onto his arms. It is okay. It is okay. I am not going anywhere now, I assured. You'll just be safer here, and even if I do leave, I am always going to come back, I promised him. Not realizing the weight of such a promise, especially when waging a war, he sulked before running down the corridor that led into a spare room, and when we were alone, Nana looked at me, and it was like I could hear even all the words that she didn't say. Who is the father? Since when? Are you okay? She finally asked, and I smiled back at her, hoping that was enough at that moment. I nodded, convincingly, even though I had yet to forget my encounter with the strange shadow earlier that day. Whenever I remembered, it still sent a shiver down my spine. Could it have been Elijah's father? Was Denver just so different that I couldn't recognize him now? It took a lot to grasp me out of my subconscious. And by a lot, I meant my grandma's voice. Adam, she called. Looking pointedly across the room as he inched closer, he'd only just gotten off the phone. Jackson is back, he is already asking after me, Adams muttered, and I looked at my Nana, a little unsure. Don't worry, Adam is very loyal to me, she assured, and I took her word for it. He needs to go back now. And you are sure he doesn't know that I am back yet? I questioned. We were extra careful driving here. I am not sure anyone else does, he replied. So how am I going to see my dad? What is the plan here? The moonlight ball is tomorrow night, he said after a brief pause. I'll get you into Villa when everyone else is gone. Then, you'll be able to see him. Adams instructed. For now, the best thing to do is to lay low. Jackson mustn't know you are back. He gritted through his teeth, and perhaps that was the moment it truly dawned on me what I was entering. And I had no idea what was coming, you see. This was just the beginning. It was well into the dead of night when the car came to a halt. I gazed outside my windows to see people flood through the villa's entrance. They were dressed extravagantly in the brightest colors, even some wearing masks. That sort of thing wasn't unusual in werewolf ball parties. In fact, I looked to Adam, who had driven me here. I told you, he heaved. You were right. Braiding the rope of my mask through my hair, I balanced it upon the bridge of my nose, and a scoff escaped my lips. Only then was I ready to alight, and he came down too. We walked up the sidewalk, before I turned to the side again. This is the perfect disguise. We made our way up the steps, gliding through the bodies of pack members scattered around the pub, and it wasn't until we entered through the door that Adams and I came to a halt. Looking around, it wasn't any more quieter inside here. The air was filled with the intoxicating blend of laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint melodies of a live jazz band. This way. Adams drew my hand as we dashed through the heart of Oakland's grandest party, the Moonlight Ball. Not even once a year, this was a special party that was only observed right before the swearing of a new Alpha King. The Moonlight Ball would act as his final opportunity to seek a bride of the 1,001 eligible spinsters and princesses that would come lining up in front of him. At the end of the night, he must then make his decision, and the bride would move into the villa without wasting a second. The marriage would be imminent. This was tradition. There wasn't any proclaimed Alpha King that hadn't gone through this. In fact, it was even how my dad met my mom. She struck her neck up amidst the crowd, and like a light in a dark room, she drew his eyes toward her, and her alone. The two of them met during his ball almost 30 years ago, and now, unfortunately, it was Jackson's turn. His eyes had coveted the Crown and Alpha title for so long now. He was growing so impatient that he'd already set in tow all the marriage rites even before my father passed. I stopped in my tracks for a moment as my eyes scanned the crowds. The most beautiful women had lined up, their faces caked with makeup as they desperately fanned themselves so that it didn't smear. They were in haste for their lives to change forever. I wish I could tell them that it was far from a fairy tale with Jackson. "Eliana," Adams sharply called, and as I kicked my feet forward, a hard lump slipped down my throat. He drew my hands upstairs and I knew the way to my father's room. The entire place hadn't changed so much. Jackson's downstairs with Sienna. They're going through his options for a bride which could buy you some time, Adam whispered as we halted right in front of the door. "I am not sure how long, but you have to hurry up and wear the mask when you are coming out so no one sees you." He then pushed the door and they gave way with a creaky clang. The air that hit me in my face was familiar. "Be careful. I'll be waiting for you outside." Upon throwing one last look over my shoulders, my eyes met Adam's before he closed the door. The immediate silence rang through my ears, and for a moment, all I could hear were the thuds of my feet against the wooden floor. I was careful as I walked further into the room. Although the corridor was dark, there was a candlelight set upon a table in the distance. It was warmer with each step I took closer, and the moment my eyes fell on him, my heart sank into my chest. I straightened my back, pulling away from the walls. He was backing me, but I met his eyes through the mirror. "Dad?" I called softly, and there was a sting in my chest. He was immobile in a wooden chair that faced the mirror, and seeing him so lifeless that way broke my heart into pieces. I threw myself in front of him, grasping his frail, tender hands in mine. His eyes fell to me with blankness, but I could tell he was still there. My grandma said he'd been sick for some time now, that it first started with memory issues some months ago. Then he couldn't go by the day doing the normal things he usually did. His cognitive abilities started to slow down, and he couldn't even move by himself. It was like he was dying slowly, like his body was giving out, but his soul was still fighting. I could see it in his eyes that he was a fighter. He was much worse than she'd described. Maybe she didn't want to break my heart by telling me the whole truth. My father says in that chair, hands crippled and his neck bent to the side. He was drooling from his lips and his eyes, and the silence that existed at that moment was deafening. He was so much different the last time I saw him. Even though he hated me with a passion, all I ever wanted was his love. For him to one day step up for me against the abuse and the mistreatment. For him to look at me without feeling as much resentment that I took my mother's life. But all those years he hated me, and because of that, I started to hate myself too. I never got the validation from him, nor did I get a single word that wasn't a rain of insults. Yet in that moment, sympathy wrapped around my heart like a clenched fist, and a tear rolled down my cheeks. He is incapable of ruling over a pack now, Nana had said earlier that day as I sat right next to her. And the people have started to notice. You can be anything in the world, but you can't be an incapable leader, because as soon as the pack loses that respect for you, it is utter chaos. And it is not your father's fault. I know. He has been to every top doctor and medical personnel in all of New Orleans, the traditionalists, and even humans too. No one knows what this is. No one has the answer. A painful sensation shot up my chest, and it never really left me until that night. "Hey," I softly said, squeezing his hand softly. I raised his neck and wedged it more comfortably against the chair, and he closed his eyes in a way that showed relief. He didn't take them off me when they opened, like he was trying to tell me something that his lips couldn't say. For the first time, he wasn't yelling. "Yes, it is me," I whispered. "It is your daughter, and I am right here." His lips fell apart, and his teeth ended up gnashing against each other like he was cold, and with all the strength he could garner, he stammered his name. "Jason." "Jackson," I repeated after him with an arch coming between my brows. "What happened to him?" I asked. Although I knew it was a reach, All my dad did was just shake his head, and terror immediately filled his eyes. "It is okay," I reassured. "Grandma told me everything about his plan to take over the pack even though you are still alive, and I won't allow it." I gritted through my teeth, and somehow he was able to hold my hands this time. Giving it a tender squeeze, he drew my eyes back to him. My father shook his head again as he pointed to me. "Me?" He nodded. "Mati." He fought to get that word out, and it was a slap in my face because I knew exactly what he was talking about. Nana had said exactly the same thing earlier that day. "So how are we going to challenge Jackson for the Alpha title?" I asked her that morning. "Isn't there supposed to be some kind of battle?" I wasn't so familiar with the rules and traditions of the pack. I've been away for 6 years. Spare me, but at least I knew there was one way to challenge an alpha for the crown, and that was by declaring a battle. A battle where one must kill the other, and the one who survives gets the crown. I couldn't face Jackson. Don't get me wrong, I've trained for the last 6 years to be a warrior back in the commune. It wasn't that I couldn't face him. I didn't want to. It was too risky. And I was still yet to see what he looked like now. "No, Eliana. Luckily, I wouldn't have to. There is one other way you can challenge him for the crown. Being the firstborn child of the throne, even as a woman, you are entitled by right to the crown." "But I can't be an alpha," I interrupted, and Bloodhound wasn't as progressive yet to have their first soul ruling Luna. I could force my way to the throne, but what was the point if they never respected me? Besides building it back up from the mess, it was now would take more than me. There was no way I could do this on my own. "But your mate can." My grandma interrupted my thoughts, and I batted my lashes for a moment. "My mate," I echoed. "You may not be able to challenge for the crown all by yourself. Not unless you present your mate as a contender. Now, he would be the one to fight Jackson, and should he win, you both get to rule the pack and Jackson's gone," she explained, but I was still hung up on that one word. Mate. Did she know who my mate was? This is unbelievable. This is impossible. "Eliana, I can't." "Ma," I shook my head. "I don't have a mate," I lied. "And even if I did, I would probably still prefer fighting Jackson myself," I added, and she heaved an exhausted sigh. "But it is the only way," she chastised, but I ended up standing from the chair. "I mean it." "I can't," I argued. "That is final." Storming out of the room, the memories flooded back to me in hot flashes. That night, him across the room, the papers laying in front of me, and his soulless eyes when he muttered those words. "I, Alpha Malik Denver, hereby reject you, Eliana Jacobs, as my mate, bringing an end to this union." His voice sliced through my heart that day, and I don't think I ever fully healed. Sometimes, I thought there really was no healing from something like that. You see, in a lifetime, you only get one mate. But finding that person isn't always the hardest part. It is making sure that you both accept the mate bond, giving in to the fate of whatever the moon goddess has planned for you. It is tying your souls together so you won't ever be alone again. But when your mate ends up rejecting you, it doesn't just mean rejecting that fate. It also means all your life. You are going to spend it alone. Second chance mates were only for those who had lost their loved one to an unjust death. But at the end of the day, it is the moon goddess who decides who gets what and who gets who. And from that day, I accepted that I wasn't going to get anyone else. I accepted a life without a mate because I already had the greatest gift of all, and that was my son, Elijah. I was content. I didn't really need more. I didn't really need him. Until now. You have to present your mate as a contender. My grandmother's words kept echoing in my ears as I stood there. I knew that was what my father was trying to say too. But it was much more complicated than that. I wish they knew. I wish they knew. that I'd tried. Denver wanted nothing to do with me the last time. He'd made it abundantly clear, and I'd spent the past 6 years hating him from afar. There simply had to be another way. But just then, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps drawing close to the door. I charged my eyes up, and in a split second, the locks clicked, and the doors opened again. My heart sank in my chest immediately. Shit. I cussed, immediately throwing myself to the ground as I crawled behind the table, making my way into the curtains that split halfway across the room. I was panting heavily from my lips. Although I tried my best to be silent, the door was left open for a while. Someone had walked in. My heart pounded against my chest as I clutched my lips with my hands. I heard the sound of approaching footsteps move even closer, and terror creeped into my eyes. I remained as still as a sculpture as a shadow drew across the room, heading toward my father. It was when I peeked a second time that I saw her. Nora. A soft gasp escaped my lips. She walked right to him with her face buried into a book in her hands. But she halted when she got to my dad's table. Our dad's table. The thing is, after my mum died, Sienna bore 2 more children for my father. One was Jackson, and the other, about 20 years old now, was Nora. She could be quite invisible in the pack, usually just throwing her complete self into whatever book she was reading at that time. It was all she ever did for the short time I knew her, but she was different now. Her hair was a darker shade of brown, long and fluffy across her shoulders, and she was dressed in an emerald blue gown to suit the theme of the night. I could how much she dreaded it with each step she took. She was quite relieved to be away from the dance floor, but she did more than take a deep breath. As soon as the door closed, she halted for a moment as if trying to sniff out a distinct scent in the room. She could sense that someone else was there, someone close. I wasn't sure how sharp her wolf was or whether or not she'd even gotten it, but in that moment I was afraid. I remained as quiet as I could out of fear that she'd be able to sniff me out. Silence ravaged the atmosphere until some footsteps were heard from the room above. Nora resumed whatever she was doing, perhaps admitting that the scent was probably coming from upstairs. I heaved a sigh of relief. She placed the heavy-spined book that she was reading on my father's bedstand, and she pulled out something from her pocket. On her left side, she poured him a glass of water, but in her right hand was a sachet of something. Something powdery that she emptied into my dad's glass. He wasn't looking. His eyes were face down, or maybe he didn't care. Nora was quick, handing him the glass of water, and then throwing glances nervously around the room. Here her voice echoed, and she stuffed the glass between his lips, emptying the water down his throat. My father choked for a second, but she helped by patting down his back. Finishing the entire glass was no easy feat, so when she was gone, Nora placed the empty to the table and threw whatever that was in her hands into the trash. She smothered her dress for a second in the mirror before she walked out of the room. As soon as she closed the door, a heavy exhale fled my lips. I didn't notice how much I was holding my breath until she left. So as I climbed from behind the curtain, I panted slowly. The first thing I did was walk up to my dad, and I had to hold his head up because of how terribly sleepy he'd gotten in a matter of seconds. My eyes darted to the glass, and I picked it up. There was something in there, something that she'd given him. And I knew better than to assume it was his medicine because of how suspiciously she threw glances over her shoulder. I walked to the trash and picked up the sachet of whatever she poured into his drink, and my heart stomped with a realization. Could they have been poisoning him all this time? Dad! I grasped his hands, shaking him a little, but his head fell back and his eyes closed. Shit, I cussed, slipping it into my pocket. I was about to get out anyway when my eyes suddenly caught something across the table. It was Nora's book, which she had forgotten behind. My heart seized in my chest as I looked back at the door. Shit! I wasn't quick this time because immediately the doors drew open again. Nora walked in and her eyes locked into mine. She screamed like she'd seen a ghost while sheer horror plastered across my face. What are you doing here? She stuttered, reaching for her phone, but I picked up my pace and brushed past her shoulders. I ran out of the room and down the corridors, heavy breaths echoing from my lips as I grasped the ends of my gown. Nora should have never seen me. If she knew I was back in Oakland, it wouldn't take long until Jackson did too. My heart was pounding, and a migraine steered through my head, so the million thoughts that raced through it. But I didn't stop running, in and out the doors, gliding through the bodies across the ballroom floor. Sprinting down the stairs, I weaved through the labyrinthine mass of people, my hair flying behind me like a flag of desperation. I threw several glances back, and one too many times. I swear I saw a flash of Nora's eyes far behind. But yet, it was as if I could feel her breath on my neck. I focused on increasing my speed and getting out of there as fast as I could. Before I came flooding out the front doors, I brought out my phone to dial Adams so he could bring the car up front. But he wasn't picking. Adrenaline burned through my veins as I ran out onto the roads and looking around. He was nowhere to be found. Neither was picking up his phone. I came to a halt for a second, running my hands through my hair. My heart was beating so fast that it could jump out of my throat at any time. The street was dark, even with the lights that dimly shone. It wasn't safe here. Fuck. I cussed. Where the hell was Adams? I threw myself behind nearby shrubs, from where I saw Nora run out the same doors I'd come out from. Panting heavily, she looked around and I could tell she still searched for me, only missing me by a hair's breadth. I watched as she placed her phone against her ears. You wouldn't believe who I just saw, Nora muttered to whoever was on the other end of the line. But most likely it was her brother Jackson. They were usually so close and inseparable, and even though she hated the pack and everything that came with it, she also loved her brother. Some might even say to a fault, so much that she would do anything for him. She could kill for him, which was why it was so terrible that she'd seen me in the first place. I closed my eyes, drawing myself up the shrubs. I couldn't take the road back home. It was too risky. So I stuck to the forest until I was able to get a hold of Adams. I called him again, the umpteenth time that night, but he still didn't pick up. I'll be waiting for you, he had assured before leaving, and it was unlike him to not keep to his word. A bolt of panic flashed across my face in that second. I kept calling him as I dragged my feet across the earth. It was awfully quiet here. Besides the creaking of the crickets and the birds chirping in the trees, the whistling waves in the nearby river, I walked more and more into the chilly night, folding my arms across my chest. Minutes passed, and then an hour. Maybe two. I sat down on a rock, resting after walking for so long. I didn't realize how far I was from my pack now, but I could still see the fireworks light the skies from the ball. It was well into midnight, which meant the party was coming to an end. But never before a burst of fireworks would erupt, commemorating that the Alpha had found his bride. I wondered for a moment who the unfortunate woman was, and dreaded what life she was about to live. They were celebrating Jackson tonight, and it left a bitter taste in the back of my throat. Knowing he'd just moved on with his life after all the terrible things he'd done to me, it rubbed me off the wrong way, that he was even celebrated at all. Monsters like him should be exiled and punished for all their wrongdoings, not hailed as the next in line alpha. But I get it, like Nana said, they were all scared of Jackson. And there was a time in my life when I was afraid of him too, more than anything else. But he not only drew the line by trying to take everything that belonged to us, but I pulled out the empty sachet of white powder that Nora had poured into my father's drink. It was possible that all this time, it had been them poisoning him. It would make sense as to why no one knew what was wrong with him. But I wondered what Nora stood to gain, as she wasn't even interested in pack hierarchy and titles and all of that. But like I said, she could kill for her brother. And by now, it was no question that she'd told him about me, barely drawn into my thoughts. I noticed something immediately dash across the corner of my eyes. I sprung from the rock, looking tensely over my shoulders. A sharp scent trickled up my nose, one I wasn't quite able to decipher because of how quickly it whistled past. But the air in the forest had suddenly grown tense, and my stomach tied into a knot. I looked around me as the moon cast its ominous glow over the tangled trees. Something in my gut prompted me to immediately start running again, which I did, slowly. I picked up my pace as adrenaline fired in my heart. Sprinting through the underbrush, I could feel something trailing right behind me. Was it Nora? Did she find me? Was it Jackson? I ran through the woods, my panicked breaths mixing with the haunting howls that echoed through the trees just then. It was a wolf, I realized, and that made me even more scared. As I ran, my heart pounded against my sternum, beating like a drum. None of this would have happened if Adam had picked up his call, help. I wasn't sure what I was yelling out for, but it was the obvious thing to do. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to be devoured by whatever was behind me. Somebody help! I screamed at the top of my lungs as tears formed in my eyes. One moment when I glanced back, I caught its lucid eyes through my blurry vision, and it all happened so fast. The wolf lunged itself at me and I tumbled across the earth. I tried to fight it off, kicking and screaming, but it's hot. Rancid breath seemed to singe the nape of my neck. Twigs snapped and leaves rustled as I came tumbling down. I caught a glimpse of its ferocious eyes, but then I realized we were headed toward the edge of the cliff. No, I screamed, trying to maneuver my way around its beastly frame. I closed my eyes as my life flashed behind them. I came really close to falling over. But then I came to a sharp halt, and as soon as I felt a hand wrapped around mine, it hit me. That touch, that sensation buried in the depths of my heart that I hadn't felt since 6 years ago, it hit me like a storm in my face. I was too scared to open my eyes, but I felt my body being lifted up in the air. As soon as my feet grazed the ground, the air was still against my skin, and there was a sharp sting where I'd wounded myself. Finally, I opened my eyes, and his aura enclosed around me like a compelling shell. I heaved a deep breath out of my lips as I turned around, and when our eyes met across the forest, the fireworks hit the skies, and that moment in time itself seemed to pause. A torrent of emotions surged within me. He was human now, breathing heavily from lips as his gaze intensely stared at me. Denver. I called his name softly as tears welled in my eyes. I wasn't sure why they did, or whether or not this was even real. He was just standing there, and my heart fluttered in a way that it had never done before. He had changed, but not so much that I wouldn't recognize him. And then finally, he parted his lips to speak. "It is you." His voice thundered with a furrow coming between his brows, and a hard lump slipped down my throat. "It is really you," he echoed.